In this video, we will do a project on HTML forms called Form a Story. So let's close this pop-up message first and let's see what we have here. Forms are great for collecting information on users like job applications or insightful surveys. However, we can also stretch our creative muscles and have a little fun with forms. For this project, we will use our knowledge of the HTML form and grab user input to put a spin on a classic story. The logic for parsing and inserting of user inputs is already taken care of in main.js using JavaScript. We have also added some styling to the page in style.css file. You can find these files by clicking on the folder icon located at the top of the code editor and selecting the files you are interested in. What you have to do is now make a form capable of collecting the correct information so that the newly crafted story makes sense. Save your code as you follow the steps to see your progress. Okay, if you get stuck during this project, check out the project walkthrough video, which can be found in the help menu. Okay, let's start the project. And let's see, we have 21 tasks in the project. Okay. Let's start with the tasks. We will be collecting information from our users using a form. Okay, of course. So first we have to add a form under the HR element inside the body of index.html. Okay, we should start by creating the form element, of course. Form element. Okay, let's save. Assign the form an action of story.html and a method of get. So first, let's create our action attribute and set that to story.html. Story.html in this case will be the page for collecting the form information or form data when you submit the form, and a method for sending the information will be get. You remember we can type lowercase and uppercase letters. Okay. We will be sending information from our form to story.html using a get request. Okay, let's save. Let's mark those completed. In the form element, create a submit button by adding an input. So you remember, you create the input field with the type attribute set to submit. Input with a type of submit, assign the value, a value of for my story exclamation point. So let's add the value attribute. Save your code to see the button rendered. The value attribute contains the text that will be shown on the button element. This might seem counterintuitive, but by creating this submit button and submitting the form, as you add more code, you can see how the final result of the story and debug in smaller chunks. Check the hint for more debugging tips. Okay, let's save the code. And here is our input element or submit button in this case. Now we can populate our form with input elements that allow users to type in their responses. We will also want to have associated labels with these input elements so users know what they are filling in. Add a label element and assign the for attribute a value of animal-1. And let's add those above the submit button. Label has the closing tag, so don't forget that. And let's set the for attribute for the label element to animal-1. Have the label render the text animal : the web page. Write your code so that the submit button always shows up at the bottom of the form. Yep, it should be the last element inside of the form element. As you add more code, the submit button should be kept at the bottom. Okay, we already got that. Let's save our code. And here is our label. And let's add BR tag. Yep, it looks better now. It is a line break, so the next element comes on the new line. Let's mark that completed. Now we can create an input to associate our label element with. Now below the BR tag, let's create the input element with the ID set to. You remember, if you want to associate the label element with the input element, the for attribute of the label element and its value should be the same as the value of the ID attribute of the corresponding input element. So animal1 goes inside the ID attribute of this input element and set the type attribute to text. Assign the name to animal1. Remember, the name attribute is needed for information from this input to be sent with the form during submission. Speaking of submission, since we want our users to put in some value, add the required attribute to the input. So this input field will be required input, so the form will not be possible to submit if you didn't populate this input with some data. And let's add some BR tag. Yep, now it looks better. Okay, let's mark this completed. We are going to be adding more labels and inputs, so we should add some spacing. Below the input element, add a line break using BR element, and we already took care of that. With the first input field and working submit button, type some text into the field and submit it. Remember, in order for you to see the new code rendered on the browser, you are going to need to save your code. We already saved our code. Everything is updated. And let's see if we type something. Animal. Let's type wolf. And you see, we submitted the form and we got redirected to the story.html page. See? It is right here. We set the action attribute to story.html, and when you submit the form, you get redirected to that page and all the data get sent to that page also. And this is a query string. I'm not gonna go through this right now. This is out of the scope of this tutorial, but I will show you what this animal-1 equals wolf represents in this case, because we used the get, then all the data, all the information you sent to this story.html page, when you submit the form, all the data is visible in the URL. Let's see. You see here you have animal-1, and right here it is animal-1 and equals to wolf because we typed wolf inside that input field and then we submitted the form, and everything is visible after the query string and everything is represented as key value pair. So the key is animal-1, and the wolf is value which we typed in the input element when we submitted the form. Okay, so this one is completed. Save, render the page again. Our story has quite a few blanks, so we are going to need a lot more labels and inputs. Add another label with a for attribute of animal-2 that renders another animal colon to the web page. Underneath the label, create a new input with the attributes. Okay, let's go right here. Add another label element, closing tag, of course, with the attribute for set to animal-2, and the text for this label should be another animal. Underneath, let's create the br tag. Oops. Input with the ID corresponding to this label. Then it should be animal-2. Type should be also text, and it also should have a required attribute and br tag. And let's change our page here. Okay, this completed. There is another animal in our story, so let's add another label with a for attribute of animal-3 that renders one more animal to the web page. So we need one more label element with the for attribute set to animal-3, and the text should be one more animal. Then let's add the br tag, then let's add the input element, ID animal-3. So we associate this input to this label right here. You already got that. Type is also text, and it should have the required attribute. Br tag. Let's save now. Yeah, you see, now we have 3 labels with 3 input elements. Okay. Let's have our users provide an adjective, add another label with a for attribute of adj-1 label element with the for attribute set to adj-1 that renders the text, this one. Then add a new input. First let's add the br tag, then let's add the input element corresponding to that label element. Type is also text. and it also has a required attribute br tag. Okay, now we have 4 labels and 4 inputs. Everything is working just fine. Let's get a verb, create a label with has a 4 attribute set to verb-1 that renders the verb ends in -eng right here. Should be a label element with the 4 attribute set to this value, and then this should be the text inside our label element. And now br tag, and now input element with the ID corresponding to that label. Type is also text. Oops. It should have a required attribute. Don't forget the br tag. Okay, it is right here, the last input. Other inputs, great. We have some inputs set up that accept text, but we can use some input with different types in our form. Let's add a field that will accept a number. First, add label with a 4 attribute of num-1 that renders the number text to the web page. So first we'll add the label element with a 4 attribute set to num-1, and this should be the text of our input field, input element, sorry. Br tag, input element again with the ID num-1. Type should be a number now, and it is also a required input field. Oops. Don't forget the br tag. Here is our number input. One of our blanks requires a yes or no. Answer sounds like we can use some radio buttons for that. Before we can add the radio buttons, add a span element that has the text yes or no. Span element with the text yes or no. Save. It's right here. We forgot the br tag. Okay, for radio buttons, you remember, we want to add the input before the label to render the radio button on the left of the text. Add an input element with the following attributes. Okay, that's why we have the input set first, because we want it on the left, and the text of the label should be on the right side. ID set to yes. Type is radio. Name attribute should be set to answer. Value should be set to yes, and this is also a required input field. Under the input, add a label. Don't add the br tag now, because we want both elements on the same line. with a for attribute assign the value of yes, of course, because we want to connect this label with this input element that renders the text yes on the web page. So with the text yes, and now we can add the br tag. Let's save. You see, here is the input and here is the label. Okay. We should now add a radio button that represents the no choice. So let's copy these two and let's change the ID to no. Type is radio, of course. Name is answer. Value is no. It is required attribute. Here goes no. Here is the no text and br tag. Under the just add input, add another label with a for attribute assign the value of no that renders the text no on the web page. This time add a line break. Let's see first. I like it how it looks. Let's leave it like this. You see, you can choose only one radio button, so you cannot choose both. The story that we are creating this form for involves some sort of speed, so let's give our users a drop-down list of speed options. Create a label and set the for attribute to speed. The label should render this text right here. Then add a select element. Okay. With an ID and name of speed. Add the required attribute to make this field mandatory. Okay, insert a BR after closing select tag. The select element will be empty for now. Okay, don't add option elements just yet. See, we don't have options right now. Inside the select, add a few options for users to choose from. One example of an option you could include is right here. Add as many or as few as you would like. Remember to assign a value and include text between the opening and closing option tags. Okay, inside our select element, let's add those option elements. The first one is faster. Let's add slower. You can add as many as you want. I will add just these two elements, faster and slow options, so you can choose between faster and slow. One of our stories, blank, requires a quote. We could provide our users with a few options, but also give them the choice of adding their own custom quote. To do this, we can use the datalist element. Oh, we forgot to save our code so we can update our page, and you see we have faster, we have slower. Okay, right here to set up the datalist element we need an accompanying label and input element. Under the last BR, add a label. So let's start with our label element with a for attribute set to quote. Have the label render the text motivational quote. After the label, add an input with the following attributes. So let's go. Don't forget the BR tag now. The input with the ID. Set to quote. Name should be also quote. The type is text. It should also have the required attribute. And don't forget the list attribute, because we are associating it with the data list element. The list attribute should be set to quote choices. Let's save our code. We forgot the BR tag. And let's see. Awesome. We should add the data list now under the input element. Assign the data list an ID of quote choices, of course. Oh, sorry. Data list. ID should be set to the same value as the list attribute of the corresponding input element. Add a BR after the closing. We already have the BR tag. Okay, let's save our code. And we don't have the options yet. Let's add a few options with values within the data list element. Right here. Let's copy the first option. Winner gets ice cream. Let's save our code and let's see the page. Now let's focus on this input element. And we get the option. We have only one option. Winner gets ice cream. Right here, winner gets ice cream. Let's add more options inside. Let's add loser gets only a cone. Now let's save. And we should have two values, two options right here. Yep, we got two options provided now. And the last task, every good story has a key takeaway. So let's finish off this form by having our users provide this message. Add a label that has a for attribute of message. Have the label render this text on the web page. Okay, let's add our last label element with this. With this. Let's first add the for attribute, set to message, and let's add meaningful message text inside our label. Under the label, don't forget our text area. If you learn about the text area, of course, in the previous exercises, that has an ID and name of message. So ID and name message. Make the text area a required field. We have so many elements now in our form. Required field. The text area should have 8 rows and 40 columns. So let's set the row attribute to 8 and call to 40. Check the hint for a syntax reminder. Okay, then add a line break after the text area element. And that should be all for this project. Let's save our code and And let's add the BR tag here, so the text area goes on the new line. Yep, it looks much better now. And we have an extra task. Fantastic job creating a form to fill in a story. If you want to challenge yourself, add pre-selected values for each input field, add placeholder text that contains examples for users, add some extra validation like mean length, or pattern to the elements that accept user input. You guys can experiment with this form and play with code, add the placeholders, the pre-filled options, mean attribute, the mean length attribute, or pattern attribute, and place some regex inside. I'm not gonna go through everything now. Let's, for example, let's see animal, and we have our first input right here. For example, you can add the placeholder and type wolf. You see, you have a placeholder now. If you click, it will go away. So you see. Okay, you can add, for example, we have our select element. It is right here, faster and slower. By default, the first option is selected, but if you want, you can type selected attribute. You see, now it is slower, even though it is the second option, but because we placed the selected attribute inside, that's why it is the selected option now. Okay, this was the last video in our form validation module on HTML. I hope you guys enjoyed this series and that you will stick with me in the upcoming lessons and lectures and learn more about web development. So we got the pop-up messages saying that we completed the module. Forms, completed project, form a story. Okay, let's click next. And we got the message saying you did it, you just finished the form. We finished the whole module. Start next lesson.